vision of, I wanted to empower every single student in my classroom to become a writer with a voice. And this took place in a middle school, 4th to 8th grade students in Glendale, Arizona. There were 40 students involved, and all of them were 9 and 10 years old. And it took place over the course of one school year. So it took place in those English language development classrooms, like Meredith spoke about, that follow the SEI model. And the two classrooms were both 4th and 5th grade classrooms. The students moved between classrooms to receive differentiated instruction, and we focused on grammar and writing for those because that's the area where English language learners need the most differentiation. Using the SEI model, it's a 4-hour block, meaning that students receive 1 hour of instruction in reading, listening and speaking, writing, and grammar. And the classroom consisted of all English language learners. 70% of them were Iraqi refugees, which was a huge influx for our school. We had had a couple of Iraqi refugees the year previous, and then all of a sudden, 2 weeks before school, there was 35 families that showed up to our school. The overall process was experiential in practice, meaning that we had experiences together, and then we grew from them. No experience was left untouched, so we debriefed every situation through authentic writing and debriefing at the end of those lessons. So like I said, most of the students I was teaching were Iraqi refugees, and this means that a lot of them hadn't been to school in years. So we spent time setting up a writer's notebook, which sounds easy until you don't have the language to access what to put into a writer's notebook. So we spent a lot of time making heart maps or things that looked similar to this. So this is one student, Ronak. This is her very first heart map. And I left it up to the students what to put into their heart map, and she chose to draw pictures. She also wrote a little bit in Arabic, and I think that she wrote that English later in the year. She went back to it and wrote that, because I don't think that she could have written that the very first day. But the heart maps were crucial for the start feeling like a true writer. We also did a lot of creating lists like Nancy Atwell describes, and then we also spent about a week setting up writers' spaces. So you can see, here's Ayat sitting in a cupboard. They found that the cupboards were empty, we had lots of cupboards, and they just asked if we could clear them out so that they could have a space to be independent writers. And that was really important to me as well, because a lot of the students coming from Iraq had seen horrific things and they just needed to feel safe. And these writer spaces were their spaces. Nobody else touched their space. So it was really kind of like their own little office and a space where they could be themselves. So before they could start writing, I told you the ELD follows that grammar and writing for 1 hour. And grammar for 1 hour is a long time. But what that meant was at the beginning of the year, we could take a whole section of the wall, and it started as just the yellow paper behind it. There was nothing on the wall. And we defined the parts of speech. So each part of speech we did motions with. So they knew exactly what the part of speech was to be able to define the words that were being put up on the board. So there was never a word put up without the students actually taking ownership for it. If they couldn't read it, if they couldn't define it, it didn't go up on the board because I knew they wouldn't lose it. So we used a lot of pictures at the beginning of the year, and then throughout the year, the words came down. So each week there was words taken down and new words put up. So once students were able to take that ownership of defining the parts of speech and knowing how language was structured, we went into defining the parts of a sentence. So up until this point, students were writing one word or labeling things, but then once we did parts of a sentence, students were able to code a sentence by using those coding ways. We would orally code the sentences. So if we said a sentence, we could code it by saying I, because the subject always got boxed. And then we could also do walked and use our fingers to show that we know what the words are doing in the sentence and how they work together. And the coding was probably one of the best ways to get students to be successful, because they could feel like they had the capacity to actually control their language. And then once students were able to actually write sentences, I started to introduce them to different sentence types. So we moved into negative sentences, interrogative, imperative, and explanatory. And that's when I started to see students were able to actually be flexible with writing. But still at this point, this was in October, so students were still copying a lot of what I was writing. And I was just happy if they were forming sentences correctly or letters correctly. So moving on, once students had the ability to write a complete sentence and know how to describe what they're writing about, I made this tree, and it's actually from a writing program. I believe it's Spivey, and I've never actually taken the training in Spivey, but I saw this tree and I loved how it helps students see how to expand sentences. So you establish that main sentence trunk, and that could be like, I walked. And then we expanded the sentences using where, when, why, and how. And I remember one of the very first sentences we wrote was, I sit, and then we moved it into, I sit on the floor after lunch to learn about writing sentences. And the students could just easily take that one sentence trunk of I sit and make it into a sentence that describes much more than just a simple statement. So then students had the ability to expand their sentences, and I wanted to get further with it. So I don't know if this actually has a true name. It's just something that I came up with one day when I was thinking, like, I don't know what to do with how to like form better sentences. But the overall goal of this project, or this part of the writing, was to create a paragraph based on a picture. So there's a picture on the left here, and that's actually from the Phoenix Art Museum. My class took a field trip to the Phoenix Art Museum, and that experience was really powerful for a lot of them. It was the first time they couldn't touch the wall, that they had to like learn how to be in a place without getting to talk all the time. Like, they just had to learn like that social etiquette. And they saw so many pictures at the museum, and the Phoenix Art Museum was great because it had all of these pictures available online. So then we also had that experience where we learned a little bit about the background from the docents, and then we brought it back into the classroom and were able to do this very structured 4-part picture, right? So in the upper left is the subjects, and we define the subject. We have simple pronouns like she, but then we also have the lady with the bag and that smiling woman, and these were all student generated. And then next to the subjects are the verbs. So the students had to think pair share a lot to come up with what verbs can we connect with each of the subjects. And then we also put in a few adjectives, and I love that tenacious happens to be on that one. It was one word that we used, or that we had instead of strong, and it just happens to be on that one. And they couldn't get over tenacious. We never used another word. But then, what was powerful about this is, you can see in the middle picture, I was able to take the coding that I spoke about earlier and give it to students just like the skeleton, and then they were able to put in the words independently. So this is where I really started to see students start to form cohesive sentences that all had an impact, or that all were connected to this particular picture. And then that continued on. So we did this very structured for a period of time. I didn't want students to go away from me independently and feel like they weren't being supported. Once everyone was showing progress, there were a few students who weren't showing as much progress, but most students, at least 80%, were showing enough ability to independently write using this very structured way of writing. So then I brought in all of these National Geographics, and my husband's grandfather just happened to have like 300 National Geographics. He said, I want those so that students can write about pictures. And National Geographic has such great pictures that a student could take a picture and actually practice the way that we were writing, doing that structured writing. So you can see, here are some more students doing that. This boy on the left, he would not write. He just didn't like it. And then this National Geographic thing just connected in his mind. He found a picture of a glacier. There was no there were no people or really any subjects in the picture. So then he just found some other people, and he actually like opened my eyes to like, oh, he can just take these two pictures, bring them together, cut out the people, and now there's a man climbing the picture. So, and you can also see this other girl over here, she's an Iraqi refugee as well, and she's writing about like this really odd picture of like all these people with their dogs. So she ended up writing a paragraph about how much these people love their dogs, and it was really about food, but it was just really great. Like she had so much to pull from that she couldn't be, there's no way for her to not be successful. So once every student was able to write independently, I moved into launching a unit, and I actually read this in Katie Woodward's book, and I launched it calling it We Are Authors, and like I said before, it's once every student was independent. So I just took simple pieces of paper, folded them in half, stapled them one time, and I was like, hey, we're all going to be authors. So we read lots of books that were relatable to the students' lives, and we studied these books. So what we first did is we read some chapter books, and these are the chapter books that I chose to read to students, because all of these were based on students who are living in a similar situation as the Iraqi students were. So Drita, my homegirl, she was a Bosnian refugee, and she came to the U.S., and it's her struggle to make it living in the U.S. with a language barrier, and also her mom is sitting at home very depressed. And a lot of the students really related to that book, and that is what initially started them to kind of feel like, I can write about my own life. Children of War, that one is purely based on Iraqi refugee children. And that one, I only read snippets because it's a question and answer book. But Deborah Ellis did a great job of finding these kids' stories and bringing them to life. She did the same thing with the kids of Kabul, and those kids aren't refugees, but it talks about their hardship of actually still living in Afghanistan. So once we read those, we did, I made a chart that we documented what every book has. So we found that there's always a cover that has a title, and we've had the author and illustrator. Then we found the title page, the dedication page, which the dedication page is something that I just have always looked past, but the students really wanted to focus on dedication page. And that was really eye-opening as well, because some of their dedications became really meaningful. And then we found that there's the first page, and starting through. We cite some guidelines that, my guideline was every page has a picture and words. I know there's some books that don't have words, but the main goal was to have writers, so that was still one of our rules. And for some of the students, they started to use dialogue. Other students, it was still simply drawing pictures, writing sentences. So we used a lot of mentor text. And this picture of, once students were writing their own stories, this picture of the plane was really awesome. It was the first time I had a student say, I'm going to read Punctuation Takes a Vacation. It has nothing to do with a person's life. It's only about punctuation. There's no punctuation in the book. But she said, you know, when I came to the U.S., it's kind of like I was taking a vacation from like this place I had been, and then she used the picture of the airplane. And the title of her book was How I Came to the USA. And she put the flag. But it was such an eye-opening book too. Her story was one of the hardest for me to get over, because she, as a first grade student, left Iraq after her dad was murdered right outside of their house. And she opened up in this story. And I just couldn't believe, like, she was finally finding her voice and being able to share it. And she said, you know, I've been holding that in my suitcase for so long. And then to get it out with her voice was really great. She was a little bit higher than some of the other students. But then this other book below, Penguin is a Starfall. It's a stage 1 reader. And Raunak, who was one of the only students to find her her voice with using like a sense of humor. The sense of humor is really advanced for a language learner. But she had this penguin that she found wearing a backpack And it's not truly a backpack, it's from National Geographic. It's a radar device that the scientists put on the penguin to track it. But she wrote a whole story about a penguin walking around. I forgot what city, it was some city, and this penguin walks around with this backpack on. But you never find out what's in the backpack. So then, the Common Core, so I think it's really great, but the argumentative text was something that I kind of struggled with. How am I going to get students to be able to take a position and defend it? Because the overall goal of the ELD classroom is for students to speak English, but they still have to have access to grade level material. So because students were so good at being able to write independently, they kind of found this to be really fun. So we took the opportunity to learn how to take a position and defend it by first, I say playing with language because we first just had pictures of 20 to 30 animals. And the students had to say what animal they wanted to talk about. We came to the consensus that we would talk about sharks, and then we came up with generalizations based on sharks. And the generalizations range from like sharks are just man-eaters, sharks are mean, sharks should be killed. And there was one boy who would not allow that. Martin, he was focused on sharks do not really want to eat people. So we actually took his generalization of sharks don't want to eat people, and we read nonfiction, fiction, anywhere that we were finding this evidence to support that sharks don't want to eat people, we were putting it up on our board. We had probably like 20 of these chart papers around the classroom because the kids were getting so into it. And this position to defend actually ended up being really easy once we had the lens for looking at it like that. But there were still times when students, I should back up for a second because we would read them and then we'd come back to the circle, kids would present their evidence and we'd give either a thumbs up, yep, that supports our claim, or a thumbs down, I don't think that supports it. But then whatever you said, like yes it does support it or no it doesn't, you had to be able to defend why you were feeling that way. So if a student said something like they do want to eat people, then students would just be able to argue against each other, saying like, no, that's not true. And the bottom line was, we found out that sharks really don't want to because they like fatty animals, and we're not fatty. And then after this, we were able to produce a book on sharks with that as kind of our thesis statement, but I just use the generalized term of our generalization or our position that we're taking is that sharks don't want to eat people. This brought us to about 3/4 of the way through the year. It was about April that I started to do an end-of-year memoir-style text. And we read a book called My Name is Parvana by Deborah Ellis. And she talks about her life in Afghanistan. So I wanted to be able to have students write like her because I felt so much ownership of writing that now I wanted to have their life stories shared. So students wrote their life stories by taking part in cultural conversations. And these cultural conversations were done in a circle. So everything I did was in a circle, and I would present a question, and then they would answer it, and I felt like that was the best way to guide their thinking, because if you say memoir, there's such varied styles. So we would do things like what object represents your family? And for me, I did this scarf I'm wearing. And then my students took it to whatever object they had. And a lot of the Iraqi students said the hijab, the headscarf that their families wear. But then we also took the time to really write about it, edit, and then publish it. So we also did heritage mapping and then took place with family discussions. A lot of the Iraqi families had actually come to the U.S. because they had been aiding the U.S. as interpreters. So a lot of the fathers spoke enough English to come into the classroom and actually discuss and help their student with their writing. The final step, I did this on purpose, was to determine a one-word title to describe their book. And this was because I wanted them to have the whole process done before they came up with the title, because I think so often they were coming up with the title first and then writing the story. But I really wanted them to be reflective and thinking about their one-word title. So here's some of the titles that they came up with. I think my favorite one is Cactus. And this one is because we read a poem by a Japanese poet, and it was called Cactus. And it described the pain of living with so much water inside and having like so much stored up inside, but then having to withstand the heat and the weather. And he's like, I feel like I have a lot going on inside of me, but I've just got to be strong and like get through it. And he did a really great job. He actually included the poem on his back cover. And some of the other ones, there's the one in the middle is hard to see, but it says pass. And this boy, it really reflected on how he felt about himself. Like he didn't have his own voice yet. He didn't know. So he just like always said, like, I always say pass when you give me the option to pass, so I pass. So we took I really celebrated this. We took the opportunity to share our published work by having every single student read their book to the class and ask questions and take part in it. And this was a really great way too for some students who didn't feel like they could speak, to really speak and be proud of what they were talking about. The student here on the left, she chose Achiever, which couldn't have fit her better because she came into the U.S., no English, and by the end of the year, she was able to actually be an advocate for herself and an advocate for herself and others. Yes, we just celebrated it a lot. So now I'm going to show you a couple of videos of the students actually reading. Okay, before the video goes, I'm just going to share a little bit about this student. This is Ronak, and she grew up in Iraq, and she went to school until first grade in Iraq. Her family was Christian, or is Christian, and after receiving several death threats, they fled to Turkey. So she had not been in school since first grade, and I met her when she was entering 5th grade. So when she came to school, she had very little educational capital, but what she did have going for her was her parents had taught her how to read and write in Arabic. We'll try it. She's kind of quiet, so she'll be great. We're just going to pause this. Okay, so sorry about that other one, but this is Fatima. She's a student that I told you about. She came from Iraq as well, and her family was actually expedited because her father was murdered, so they were brought to the U.S. much quicker, because if you don't have a man in your life in the Arabic culture, it's really hard to do anything. Like, you can't leave the house by yourself. So the U.S. took, or the United Nations took them in much quicker. But she's going to tell us a little bit about her title. Maybe. Why did you title your book Legend?
I titled my legend because Aid is a legend for my family, and my job, almost everything, Christian, medicine, and then there's a lot of stuff in that book that describes my legend. So I thought, why would I name this legend? It's legend. I feel like the legend. There's some facts about legend.
she's not very articulate, but I think like what she does describe is that it is a really meaningful title to her. And throughout her whole story, she talks about the impacts of being a Muslim living in the U.S. and what that means to her. Okay, so my reflections and insights from this were that authentic practices in the classroom put students in charge of their learning, and I really feel like that is true. Had I not done authentic writing, I feel like students would not have gotten as much out of the school year. But I think it's also important to note that when students are given choice, they have way more ownership of what they're producing and what they're doing. And then writing becomes more fluent and flexible when you do it authentically. I just felt like the students progressed at their independent levels, but what I was seeing was that students who still needed help, like I could still help them, but they were becoming more fluent within what they were doing. And by the end of the year, there's not a student who didn't take a book home at night to write. So every student was identifying as a writer, and then I fully believe that they became reflective learners, and they were able to monitor their own learning. Anytime I said, if you need extra help, I will be at the table, there would be at least 1 or 2 kids there, and I know that the other kids were being independent and successful.
Thank you, Margaret.